The vast halls of Topkapi Palace had seen many love stories, but none as extraordinary as that of Sultan Suleiman and Hurrem Sultan. It was a love that defied tradition, shattered expectations, and reshaped the very foundation of the Ottoman court. In an empire where concubines were meant to bear sons and fade into the shadows, Hurrem did the unthinkable. She captured the heart of the world's most powerful ruler and refused to let go. Suleiman the Magnificent, a sultan whose name struck fear and admiration across continents, had many women in his harem. Yet, among them all, it was a slave girl from Ruthenia who became his greatest obsession. She was born as Alexandra or Anastasia Lizowska but would be remembered by history as Hurrem Sultan, the woman who smiled her way into the throne room and never left. Unlike other concubines, Hurrem did not settle for temporary favor. She wanted permanence, power, and something no other woman had achieved before: official status as the Sultan's wife. From the moment she entered the imperial court, Hurrem was different. She was not just beautiful, she was intelligent, ambitious, and fearless. She charmed Suleiman with her wit, engaged him in intellectual debates, and, most shockingly, refused to abide by the established rules of the harem. Where others remained submissive, Hurrem laughed in the face of tradition. She had an uncanny ability to read the political landscape, and she used it to secure her position not just as a favored concubine, but as Suleiman's one and only queen. Their love was not just a personal affair, it changed the structure of the empire. In marrying Hurrem, Suleiman broke a centuries-old tradition that forbade Ottoman sultans from taking official wives. He freed her from the status of a slave, granted her influence over matters of state, and allowed her to correspond with foreign rulers, a privilege unheard of for a woman in the Ottoman court. Together, they ruled not just as lovers but as political allies, navigating a world of courtly intrigue, betrayals, and power struggles. Yet, love in the Ottoman palace was never without consequences. The more powerful Hurrem became, the more enemies she made. Rival factions, jealous concubines, and even high-ranking officials despised her influence over the Sultan. She was blamed for the downfall of Pargali Ibrahim Pasha, accused of manipulating Suleiman into executing his own son, and whispered about as the woman who had poisoned the empire from within. But whether one viewed her as a cunning schemer or a devoted wife, one thing was undeniable: Hurrem had changed the course of Ottoman history. Their love story spanned decades, but even the most powerful romance could not escape the one enemy that conquered all: time. As years passed, the vibrant and ambitious Hurrem began to weaken, her once sharp mind clouded by illness. For the first time, the woman who had fought against fate found herself powerless against it. And for Suleiman, who had built an empire on conquests, there was one battle he could never win: the battle against loss. The story of Suleiman and Hurrem was never meant to be just another tale of palace romance. It was a saga of ambition, sacrifice, and a love that shaped the destiny of an empire. But as Hurrem's final years approached, one question remained: how would the man who had ruled the world face the moment he lost the woman who had ruled his heart? Hurrem's final years: a struggle for power and health. The corridors of Topkapi Palace, once filled with the laughter of a woman who defied tradition, had grown quieter. Hurrem Sultan, the woman who had rewritten the rules of the Ottoman court, was fading. Age and illness had begun to steal the energy that once made her a formidable force. Yet, even in her final years, she remained at the center of palace intrigue, holding on to power as long as she could. For decades, Hurrem had been the most influential woman in the empire, standing beside Sultan Suleiman not just as his wife but as his closest political ally. She had outmaneuvered rivals, eliminated threats, and secured the throne for her children. But as her health declined, the battle she had fought for so long, to maintain control over the empire's future, became harder. The palace, which had once been her stronghold, had turned into a battlefield of unseen forces waiting for her to weaken. Illness had begun to take its toll on her body. While historical records do not specify exactly what plagued her, many believe she suffered from a long-term disease, possibly cancer or chronic infection. The woman once known for her radiant beauty and sharp intellect now spent more time confined to her chambers, attended by doctors who could do little to ease her suffering. The political world outside did not slow down for her illness. Intrigue continued, and those who had long waited for her downfall sensed that their moment was near. Even in her weakened state, Hurrem refused to let go of the reins of power. She continued to write letters to foreign leaders, advised Suleiman on state matters, and ensured that her sons, especially Selim, her chosen heir, remained in favor. She knew that the moment she closed her eyes for good, the struggle for the throne would begin in full force. The death of a sultan's wife was not just a personal loss, it was a shift in the political landscape. Rival factions had never forgiven her for the execution of Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son from another concubine, Mahidevran Sultan. Even though Mustafa's death had secured her own son's path to the throne, it had left deep wounds in the empire. Many still mourned the prince and resented Hurrem's influence in his downfall. Now, with her health failing, whispers grew louder. Would her enemies seek revenge? Would Mahidevran rise again in influence? Would the empire fall into chaos once she was gone? Hurrem's greatest fear was that, after everything she had done, her legacy would be erased. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to simply fade into history as just another concubine who had risen to power. So, even in sickness, she made preparations. She secured alliances, ensured her son Selim had the necessary backing, and continued to play the game she had mastered. But deep down, she must have known that her time was running out. Suleiman, though still the great ruler of an empire, was a man weighed down by age and grief. He had lost friends, his most trusted vizier, and a son, all in the name of maintaining his rule. Now, as he watched the woman he loved wither away, he faced a loss unlike any other. Hurrem was not just his wife, she was his confidant, his equal, and in many ways, the only person who had ever truly understood him. Her illness was a slow, painful reminder that even the mightiest rulers were powerless against time. As the days passed, Hurrem's appearances in court became less frequent. The woman who had once walked the palace halls with confidence now moved with frailty. The courtiers, the same ones who had once feared her, now watched and waited. Some with sadness, others with anticipation. The end of Hurrem Sultan was not just the end of a woman, it was the end of an era. In the spring of 1558, the inevitable happened. Hurrem Sultan, the first legal wife of an Ottoman sultan in centuries, the woman who had changed the very fabric of the empire, breathed her last. The palace that had once echoed with her laughter now stood in silence. The power struggles, however, were just beginning. But there was one question that lingered over all. What would Suleiman do now, without the woman who had shaped his rule and his life? The death that broke Suleiman, his reaction and grief. For over 40 years, Sultan Suleiman had ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents. He had led countless conquests, expanded Ottoman dominance, and built a legacy that would last for centuries. But nothing had prepared him for the battle he now faced, the battle against grief. When Hurrem Sultan, his beloved wife and closest confidant, took her final breath in 1558, something within the mighty ruler broke. The man who had once stood unshaken on the battlefield now found himself lost in sorrow. Hurrem was no ordinary consort, she was the woman who had stood beside him in both war and peace, the only one he had ever truly loved. Their relationship had defied Ottoman tradition, and in her, Suleiman had found not just a wife but a partner, an advisor, and perhaps the only person in his life who understood the weight of ruling an empire. Her death was not just a personal loss, it was a seismic shift in his world. The news of her passing sent a wave of grief through the palace. The corridors that once echoed with her voice now felt empty. Servants whispered, courtiers lowered their gazes, and the empire held its breath, waiting to see how the Sultan would react. In a court where emotions were often hidden behind layers of protocol, Suleiman made no effort to disguise his sorrow. His grief was visible to all. Unlike previous sultans who treated their wives and concubines as dispensable, Suleiman's devotion to Hurrem had been different. He had granted her a status no woman had held before, breaking centuries-old traditions by making her his legal wife. He had written poetry for her, sent her letters filled with longing during military campaigns, and relied on her wisdom in state affairs. Now, with her gone, he was left with an emptiness that no power or conquest could fill. The funeral of Hurrem Sultan was a moment of profound mourning. She was buried in a grand mausoleum near Suleiman's own mosque in Istanbul, a testament to her significance in his life. Unlike many consorts who were sent to distant provinces upon their death, Hurrem remained close to the heart of the empire, even in death. Her resting place was adorned with intricate designs, Quranic inscriptions, and a domed structure that reflected her status as the most powerful woman in Ottoman history. But for Suleiman, no monument could replace the presence of the woman he had loved so deeply. After her burial, the Sultan withdrew from public life more than ever before. Those close to him noticed a change. The once ambitious and determined ruler became a man weighed down by sorrow. His health began to decline, and he no longer showed the same enthusiasm for war or governance. Though he continued to rule, something had shifted. His heart was no longer in it. Suleiman expressed his grief in the only way he knew how, through poetry. Throughout his life, he had written verses under the pen name Muhibi, and now, in his sorrow, he turned to words once more. In one of his most famous poems, he lamented, "My love, my heart's companion, my soul's delight. Gone you are, leaving me in endless night." His verses revealed a man who, despite ruling the world's most powerful empire, was now simply a heartbroken husband longing for the woman he had lost. As time passed, Suleiman's grief did not fade, it deepened. He no longer found joy in the pleasures of court life. His closest advisors, including the Grand Vizier, saw the toll Hurrem's death had taken on him. His once sharp political instincts dulled, and he grew increasingly isolated. The harem, which had once been a place of warmth with Hurrem by his side, now felt cold and distant. For the empire, the loss of Hurrem marked a turning point. With her gone, the political landscape began to shift. The balance of power in the palace, once held firmly in her grasp, started slipping into the hands of others. The struggle for succession became fiercer, and the rivalry between her sons, particularly Selim and Bayezid, intensified. Hurrem had been the force that kept the court's chaos in check, and without her, the stability she had fought so hard for began to unravel. Suleiman's grief extended beyond emotions, it had real consequences for the empire. The Sultan who had once led his armies with unmatched determination now hesitated. His campaigns, though still successful, lacked the same fire. His focus on governance waned, and his reliance on his officials increased. Some historians believe that Hurrem's death marked the beginning of Suleiman's decline, not just as a husband, but as a ruler. Yet, despite his sorrow, one thing remained unchanged: his love for Hurrem. Even in his final years, he continued to honor her memory. When he passed away in 1566, 8 years after her death, he was buried beside her, in a tomb not far from the mosque that bore his name. In death, as in life, they remained together. Hurrem Sultan had been more than just a wife, she had been the heart of Suleiman's empire. Her absence left a void that could never be filled. For all his military victories, political achievements, and the grandeur of his reign, it was love and loss that ultimately defined Sultan Suleiman's darkest hour. How the empire changed after her death. The death of Hurrem Sultan in 1558 did not just leave Sultan Suleiman in mourning, it left a power vacuum in the heart of the Ottoman Empire. For years, Hurrem had been the invisible force steering political decisions, shaping alliances, and maintaining balance within the palace. Her absence set off a chain reaction that reshaped the empire, influencing everything from court politics to the succession struggle between her sons. Without Hurrem's sharp political instincts and calculated diplomacy, the palace became a battlefield for influence. She had spent decades ensuring that her son, Selim, would ascend to the throne, but now that she was gone, there was no one to protect his claim with the same cunning and determination. The rivalry between Selim and his brother Bayezid intensified, leading to a brutal conflict that would shake the empire's foundations. Hurrem had been a master manipulator, forging alliances within the harem, among the viziers, and even within the military. With her gone, factions formed, each trying to fill the void she had left behind. The once controlled power struggles became unpredictable. Even Rustam Pasha, her most trusted ally and son-in-law, found himself vulnerable. Hurrem had shielded him from political enemies, but after her death, his influence began to wane. Within a year, he was dismissed as Grand Vizier, showing just how much his power had depended on Hurrem's presence. But the most dramatic shift came in the Sultan's own court. Suleiman, now an aging and grieving ruler, withdrew further from governance. He had once been an emperor who personally led military campaigns and closely monitored political affairs, but after Hurrem's death, his energy for ruling diminished. He spent more time in solitude, writing poetry, and reflecting on his loss. His once iron grip over the empire loosened, giving more power to bureaucrats and viziers. With Suleiman emotionally absent, corruption within the government grew. Officials who had once feared his wrath now took advantage of his detachment. Bribery, favoritism, and inefficiency seeped into the administrative system. The empire still held immense power, but the disciplined structure that had made it formidable under Suleiman's peak years started to show cracks. One of the most immediate consequences of Hurrem's absence was the bloody struggle between her sons. For years, she had worked tirelessly to ensure that Selim, rather than his more capable brother Bayezid, would inherit the throne. But now that she was gone, Bayezid saw an opportunity. Their father was aging, the court was in disarray, and the moment seemed ripe for him to challenge his brother's claim. Bayezid gained support among the military and certain regional governors, leading to a civil war between the two brothers. The conflict was brutal and stretched over several years, ending in 1561 when Bayezid, after fleeing to Persia, was handed over to the Ottomans and executed along with his sons. Selim, the weaker of the two, ultimately took the throne after Suleiman's death in 1566. But many historians believe that had Hurrem been alive, she would have found a way to prevent such a costly and destructive war. Beyond palace politics, Hurrem's death also had a broader cultural and social impact. She had been an advocate for charitable projects, commissioning mosques, schools, hospitals, and soup kitchens across the empire. These projects continued after her death, but the personal touch she had brought to them was gone. Her ability to use philanthropy as a tool for influence had been unique, and no other consort or queen mother wielded it with the same effectiveness. Her death also marked the beginning of a shift in the role of royal women. While she had opened the doors for women to hold political power, her absence left a void that was only partially filled by later queen mothers. The Sultanate of Women period that followed saw women like Nurbanu Sultan and Kosem Sultan playing key roles in governance, but none had the same blend of intelligence, charm, and strategic brilliance that Hurrem had possessed. The empire continued to expand militarily under Suleiman, but its internal stability had been shaken. The careful balance between power and loyalty that Hurrem had maintained unraveled. It was not just her political mind that was missed, it was her ability to keep Suleiman engaged, to advise him, and to steer decisions in a way that benefited the dynasty. Without her, the empire still functioned, but it lacked the same cohesion. By the time Suleiman himself passed away in 1566, the empire had changed drastically from what it had been during Hurrem's lifetime. It was still vast, still powerful, but cracks had formed, cracks that would only deepen in the following century. Hurrem's death was not just a loss for Suleiman personally, it was a turning point for the Ottoman Empire, a moment when one of its greatest minds was silenced, leaving behind a legacy of ambition, power, and an empire forever altered. Did Suleiman ever find peace? After Hurrem Sultan's death in 1558, Sultan Suleiman was never the same. The man who had once been the most powerful ruler in the world, leading his empire to military and political dominance, now found himself lost in grief. Hurrem had been more than his wife. She was his closest confidant, his advisor, and the one person who truly understood him. With her gone, a deep sadness took hold of him, affecting not only his personal life but also his rule over the empire. In the immediate aftermath of Hurrem's death, Suleiman withdrew from the world. He spent more time in solitude, his grand palace in Topkapi turning into a place of silence rather than the political and cultural hub it once was. Those closest to him noted that he spoke less, engaged less, and seemed burdened in a way that even his greatest military defeats had never managed to do. He had always been a man of deep thought and poetry, but now, his verses reflected sorrow, longing, and a yearning for reunion in the afterlife. Despite his grief, the responsibilities of ruling an empire as vast as the Ottoman realm did not allow him to completely disappear. But those who had known him in his younger years saw the change. The once vibrant and ambitious Sultan, who had led his armies across continents, now preferred to stay in Istanbul, relying more on his viziers to manage affairs of state. He still made decisions, but the fire that had once driven him seemed dimmed. One of the most devastating blows to his already weakened spirit came just 3 years after Hurrem's death. In 1561, he was forced to order the execution of his own son, Prince Bayezid, along with Bayezid's children. The succession struggle between Bayezid and Selim had been simmering even before Hurrem's death, but without her strategic mind guiding the situation, the conflict escalated into open war. Bayezid, seeing his chance to claim the throne, gathered an army and challenged Selim. The civil war between the brothers was brutal, dragging the empire into a costly and bloody conflict. Bayezid eventually fled to Persia, hoping for refuge, but Suleiman, unwilling to risk a future challenge to Selim's rule, negotiated his return and ordered his execution. The decision haunted him. He had already lost his firstborn, Prince Mustafa, years earlier, a decision that Hurrem had played a role in orchestrating. Now, another son was gone, this time without her guidance to justify or soften the blow. By this point, Suleiman was an old man. His health was failing, and the empire he had built no longer felt like his own. The court was filled with intrigue, and the corruption he had once fought against had crept deeper into his administration. Hurrem had been his anchor, the one who kept him engaged in governance and ensured that the empire remained stable. Without her, he seemed to drift, fulfilling his duties out of obligation rather than passion. In his final years, Suleiman became increasingly introspective. He found solace in religion, spending more time in prayer and reflection. The man who had conquered vast lands, who had been known as the lawgiver for his reforms, now seemed to care little for politics and power. He wrote poetry expressing his sorrow, speaking of love, loss, and the fleeting nature of life. One of his most famous verses from this period reflected his pain. "The world is but a dream, and we are but travelers passing through. What is power, what is wealth, when the heart is empty?" Despite his grief, Suleiman did not completely abandon his duty as a warrior. Even in his final years, he led his empire into battle. In 1566, at the age of 71, he set out on one last military campaign, his 13th expedition, to besiege the fortress of Szigetvar in Hungary. Some believe that this final campaign was his way of escaping the sorrow that had engulfed him in Istanbul. Others see it as his last attempt to prove to himself that he was still the great ruler he had once been. The campaign was brutal, and the aging sultan was not in the best health to endure the hardships of war. He fell ill during the siege but refused to show weakness. Even as his body weakened, his mind remained focused on victory. But on September 6, 1566, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent took his final breath. His death was kept a secret from the troops for several days, as his commanders feared it would demoralize the army. Eventually, the fortress fell, marking one last victory for the man who had built one of the greatest empires in history. Did Suleiman ever find peace? It depends on how one defines peace. If peace meant happiness, then the answer is no. After Hurrem's death, he was never truly happy again. He carried the weight of her loss, the burden of his own decisions, and the loneliness of absolute power until his last breath. But if peace meant acceptance, then perhaps he did. In his poetry, in his prayers, and in his final moments on the battlefield, he seemed to come to terms with the life he had lived. In the end, he was buried beside Hurrem in the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, a final testament to the love that had shaped his reign. Even in death, he wanted to be close to her. Perhaps that was the only peace he ever truly found. Conclusion: the end of an era, the beginning of a new struggle. The death of Sultan Suleiman in 1566 marked not just the end of a powerful ruler's life, but also the close of an era that had defined the Ottoman Empire at its peak. With his passing, the empire entered a period of transition, one that would determine whether the foundations he had laid would stand strong or begin to crumble. But long before his own death, the real end of an era had already begun with the loss of Hurrem Sultan. Hurrem had been a force unlike any other in the Ottoman court. She had redefined what it meant to be a woman in power, influencing the empire's politics, shaping its diplomatic strategies, and ensuring that her own bloodline continued the dynasty. Her death was not just a personal tragedy for Suleiman, it was a shift in the very balance of power within the palace. Without her, Suleiman had lost his most trusted advisor, and the court became a battlefield of competing ambitions. The years after her passing saw the intensification of political rivalries that she had once carefully managed. The struggle between her son Selim and his brother Bayezid, which resulted in Bayezid's execution, proved that even Hurrem's meticulous planning could not entirely prevent the brutality of Ottoman succession conflicts. When Suleiman died, the empire was already in the hands of Selim II, a ruler vastly different from his father. Unlike Suleiman, who had personally led military campaigns and expanded the empire's borders, Selim II preferred the luxuries of the palace. He would later be remembered as Selim the Drunkard, a stark contrast to his father, who had ruled with discipline and military strength. His reign saw the increasing power of the palace officials, the grand viziers, and most importantly, the women of the imperial harem. The period known as the Sultanate of Women, where queen mothers and consorts held significant influence, began to take full shape in the years following Suleiman's rule. But while the empire still stood strong after his death, cracks had begun to form. Corruption crept deeper into the administration, and the once disciplined Janissary Corps, the elite military force of the empire, became more unruly. The empire's expansion slowed, and without a ruler of Suleiman's caliber, the political landscape became more vulnerable to internal conflicts. Despite these challenges, Suleiman's legacy endured. His legal reforms continued to shape the Ottoman judicial system for centuries. The Suleymaniye Mosque, where he and Hurrem were laid to rest, stood as a monument to the golden age of Ottoman architecture. His military victories remained legendary, and even those who ruled after him looked to his reign as a model of what the empire should aspire to be. In many ways, the end of Suleiman's era was also the beginning of a new struggle, one between tradition and change, between the ideals of a disciplined empire and the emerging complexities of palace politics. The empire would continue to exist for centuries, but it would never quite reach the heights it had under his rule. The world he had built, shaped by his love for Hurrem and his vision for a vast and just empire, had started to slip away even before he took his last breath. His story, and that of Hurrem, remains one of the most captivating chapters in Ottoman history. It is a tale of love and ambition, power and betrayal, victories and regrets. It is a reminder that even the greatest rulers are, in the end, human, shaped by the people they love, the choices they make, and the struggles they leave behind.